Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Kalayim, Perek Aleph, Halacha Zayin, and Halacha Ches. We're going to be learning today Daf Vav. We left off on Daf Hey Amid Beis, Mamish, all the way on the bottom of the Amid, the last line. Ve'im Kain Laman Eskalkala Haaretz. We'll speak about the words Ve'im Kain in a moment. Let's quickly go back. We learned something really fascinating that in Parshas Kedoshim, when the Torah in one pasuk gives us three prohibitions, right? Behem techoloi sabia kalayim and sot choloi sizra kalayim ubeged kalayim shatnes loyala alecha. That pasuk begins with the words as chukoisai tishmeru, which literally means we have to keep Hashem's chukim, and the pshat is that as chukoisai tishmeru is an introduction to all of the three types of kalayim mentioned in this verse. Ultimately, kalayim is a chok, in as much as we have, like in all chokim, we have a lot of insights, but it's considered a mitzvah that's completely supra-rational. Nevertheless, the Gemara in Daf Hey said that as chukoisai tishmeru is the source that we're not allowed to graft trees, because we do not have a explicit pasuk that prohibits grafting of trees. Okay, now, the Gemara said, again on that base, that the Tana, Rabbi Elazar, who understands the words as chukoisai tishmeru in reference to a chok that God already gave us in the past, right? Chukim shechokakti kvar bo'il. What's the chukim shechokakti kvar? Rabbi Elazar holds that even though we are familiar with the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach, truth be told that from the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach, according to Rabbi Elazar, 6 of them were given to Adam Arishon. It was only the Ever Menachai that was added to Noach post-Mabul, because from then on, human beings were allowed for their consumption to take the life of the animal kingdom, to shecht an animal, before Matan Torah to kill an animal, after the Torah was given to the Jewish people to shecht an animal, prior to which shechita was allowed only in the context of a korban. Otherwise, if an animal died, I don't know how the health is, or you can eat the animal's flesh, but we were not allowed to kill an animal, and there was no need to give us the commandment prohibiting torturing or inflicting pain for no reason, unnecessary pain on animals. And all of this is Rabbi Elazar. And it's not only the Sheva or the 6. Really, according to Rabbi Elazar, God commanded Adam, he's not allowed to graft trees. And that is what Hashem means when he writes, as chukoisai tishmeru, that the laws, specifically tree grafting, the prohibition of tree grafting that I already gave in the past, Hashem says, I am re-giving it to the Jewish people. However, that only fits according to Rabbi Elazar, that indeed holds that Adam Arishon was commanded with many mitzvahs. According to the Tana Rabbi Yehuda, that the only mitzvah that Adam and Chava were commanded with was against serving Avodah Zarah. Now, how does that really fit with the prohibition of eating from the Eitz Hadas? Really, all of this is connected to Avodah Zarah, but let's not get into this right now. So the Gemara had a very novel interpretation. You're right. As a commandment, Hashem commanded Adam and Chava not to serve Avodah Zarah. But you have what the Gemara calls, do not tamper with the laws of nature. Not that Hashem told Adam, commanded Adam, instructed Adam. No, that there is a natural law of order, and that is that everything was created according to its own species, naturally. When you plant a seed of an apple, what comes out? An apple. And it's self-understood from the laws of nature that we're not allowed to change what we would call today these strands of DNA. This was the concept. Coming off this concept, we might have the version, the girsa, im kain, or im kain, as the Gemara opens up. We'll speak it out right now. Lama niskalkala haaretz. The earth was cursed. And that is one of the consequences that happened after the fall of man, as written explicitly in Parshas Bereshis. That after Hashem spoke out the consequence for Chava, for the Nachash, for Chava, for Adam, then the Torah says that the earth itself will no longer produce as it was meant to produce in the beginning, and going forward, and even after human being toils, the earth doesn't only produce that which is edible. Sometimes you invest a lot of effort, and what comes out of the ground are thorns, things that are of no value. And here the question is, this is going to be a very deep Gemara. Let's see how much time we'll have to spend on it. That, yeah, of course, the pshat is that man sinned and the earth was cursed. But perhaps for the earth to be cursed, there has to be some sort of sin that the earth committed for it, so to say, to be worthy to be cursed, even though it wasn't cursed when it sinned. These words will be explained a bit more when we learn it inside. But now that we said that there is a natural, there's laws of nature, nature means something that Hashem imbued in the world that keeps on repeating itself. If there's laws of nature, which there are, so nature never sinned. Nature is just following its own system, the system that Hashem put into it. So l'choyer, it's not even shayach for earth to sin. So why was the earth cursed? That will be one way of understanding the Gemara's opening question. We're going to learn in the Marafulda that ultimately says that the words imkain doesn't even exist, because from the answer of the Gemara, we're going to have a problem if that would be the way we were to understand the question. But all of that when we get inside. So there's going to be some back and forth about, did the earth sin? Did the earth not sin? And from there, the Gemara is going to turn to discuss the prohibition of mating diverse species of birds. We will also have today a brayso that will discuss the prohibition of grafting an olive branch onto a date tree. And as we will see, there's something very unique about an olive branch, that even if you graft it, the product of the branch, the olive, will never change. The olive does not subject itself to be changed by grafting, which is a bracha that the olive has. And as we'll speak out, so why should it even be prohibited if the prohibition is only if it produces a crossbreed? That will be the topic of Halacha Zayin. And on Daf Vav Amid Beis, we will learn the next Mishnah, Halacha Ches. The Mishnah will provide examples of various prohibited or forbidden grafts, specifically trees in vegetables and vegetables in trees. In either direction, it will be prohibited. And at the end of today's daf, we will begin to touch on the topic of Kilei HaKedem. Now, what's unique about the prohibition of planting grains / greens, legumes together or in close proximity to vines or to a vineyard is that it's way beyond Marasayim. When it comes to a vine, when it comes to a kedem, to grapes, there mamish has to be a minimum amount of distance separating whatever the plant is with the vine. And let me just share a couple of spaces that we will be learning. And there will be a big difference whether you are planting something near a vineyard. Near a vineyard, you may not plant anything within 4 amas, dalad amas. But if you only have a vine, not a vineyard, there the prohibition is to plant something within 6 tfachim, which is, in other words, you can relatively plant something a lot closer. However, what we will learn today is that these measurements of either dalad amas or 6 tfachim is regarding a plant that's protruding above the surface of the ground. That may not be with either a single vine or with a vineyard, again, that's protruding above the ground, above the surface. What happens if you have things that are in the ground, but they're not surfacing? So what we will learn is it's a whole different shear, and that shear will be only of 3 tfachim, which ironically will actually mean that if one knows what they're doing, you can plant under a vine or under a vineyard items that are further than 3 tfachim, deeper. So if you have, we'll speak about a watermelon, right, or any other vegetable that you plant in the ground. So if they want, they can plant something deep in the ground, not even that deep. In other words, it covers the 3 tfachim measurement, and you can plant above the surface a vine, and you're not violating at all Kilei HaKedem, as we'll see why we get into these details when we will conclude with God's help today's daf. Okay, so let's start Chevron daf Hey Amid Beis. Again, there's a question whether we begin with the words ve'im kain, whether we do not have the words ve'im kain. The Gemara wants to know, Lama neskal kol ha'aretz, why was the world, why was the earth cursed? Now look inside the last maraful on that Hayomid base. Ve'im kain lama neskal kol ha'aretz. In other words, kiven sholi avra al tzivir shalak kadosh baruch hu. Based on what we just explained, that aside of the concept of there being commandments which were given to man and to Noach, there is this concept that we introduced of that there is a natural law of order. And whenever we see in nature a certain system, it's self-understood that we're not allowed to break that natural law of order. Well, if there's a natural law of order, then when Hashem created the world followed that Seder, followed that nature. So why is it that they were cursed? Based on a presumption that even though, of course, it was cursed only after man sinned, but if the earth would not have done anything, so to say, wrong, even though man sinned, why would the earth be cursed? That's the Gemara's kash. That's just explaining the meaning of ve'im kain. What's the link? Now, he brings in the bottom that over Bereshis Rabbah, we have the same Gemara in a Medrash, and over there, legaras im kain, and the Marafulda concludes, excuse me, it's actually the right way of learning Pshat, and I understand why the Marafulda is saying it, because the Gemara's answer won't resolve this issue. No, if the issue is God created the world with a certain nature, so whatever happens in nature is natural. We, man, we have the ability with Seichel to sort of say, to get into that and to modify that, and it's self-understood, we're not allowed to do that. That won't be resolved in the Gemara's answer. So therefore, the Gemara is asking you a question. Now that we spoke about how everything was created, Lemineihem, Lemineihu, Leminam, so why was the earth cursed? And as we will see, a phenomenal, this is a piece of Agadata that's Gavaldik, a machlokes amoyroyim as to what happened in the beginning of the creation. Many of us are very familiar with the topic, right? When Hashem created, when Hashem commanded, as we learned also at the end of last year, in the account of creation, you have a pasuk that says, Vayomer Elokim, God commanded for something to happen, and then the Chumash records what indeed happened. Vatoitzei ha'aretz. And if you juxtapose what God commanded and what the earth gave forth when it came to the trees, there is an inconsistency. And let's read it inside. Rabbi Yudan Bar Shalom Amar, that there was some failing, so to say, in nature. It did not fully obey what God commanded. It went against its own nature. It violated its own natural law. There was some sort of transgression. And where do we find this transgression? Because when God commanded, look inside the words, the Gemara quotes all the words of the pasuk. I mean, I can quote it right now. If you have it, Aleph, it says, Vayemer Elokim, in other words, in the command, Tachei ha'aretz desha, kamo, Esev mazriya zera. So far, we're not going to focus on these words. And then God commanded eitz peri, not eitz peri, oisa peri liminoi. That a eitz peri should produce peri liminoi. That is in the command. Now, in the next pasuk, when Hashem records what happened, which is the earth obeying or perhaps disobeying God's command, vatoitze ha'aretz desha, esev mazriya zera, limineu, that's what we learned in the end of last year. See, the words limineu was not even written in the commandment. Okay. But now the focus will be, it doesn't say ve'etz peri oise peri liminoi. It only says ve'etz oise peri asher zara boy limineu. There's a change. God commanded for the earth to give forth eitz peri. When the earth gave forth the eitz oise peri. Now let's read inside the Gemara. But it did not give eitz peri. Guys, eitz peri means a tree, that the tree itself is a fruit, which means that Hashem commanded for the earth to give forth trees, that the trees themselves are edible. And when the earth gave forth trees, it didn't give forth trees that they themselves are edible, but the trees produce edibles. They produce fruits that are edible. But I know the words that I'm saying now got robbed by a certain community of people, but the edibles that I'm talking about is fruits. So this was, according to Rabbi Yudan, this was some sort of deviation that that the earth did, and as the Medrash writes, that the earth said to itself, so to say, if I'm going to produce trees, that the wood, the trunk, the tree itself is edible, then people will eat up the trees. What happens when you give immature people a lot of money, instead of putting it in the bank or investing it in who knows where and living off the interest? By Deloy Kalia Karno, at least you give the continuity to the keren. You eat up the keren. So you party with the keren, and then there's nothing left. What Hashem wants us to live off residual income. And what do people do? They live off the thing itself. You know, people have businesses. I remember the biggest expense in the shmata business is yarn. You make a sale, a machaya, $50,000 sale. $35,000 is to replenish the yarn. People go ahead and they party with all the money. The revach was very little, right? The raw material is the big bulk of the expense. So it didn't trust mankind, or the earth, so to say, sensing that man is not mature enough for self-preservation, it made a deviation. Now, obviously, we're not speaking about the earth itself. The earth doesn't have freedom of choice. We are speaking about the mazel, like we spoke in the beginning of the Masechta, that everything lamata has a mazel l'mayla, and the mazel that's giving chayis to the earth, etc., has a lot of seichel, has a lot of understanding. Now, can the mazel of the earth have the ability to go against God's will? I just want people to be familiar that we have in Chazal stories. Remember, Danny, of a malach that got malchus. We have these stories in the Gemara, and we have a lot more of that in Kabbalah. Malachim also don't have freedom of choice. So how can malach matat give an angel malchus, etc.? Is a raya that on some level, even though the type of freedom of choice that was granted uniquely to mankind, and within the mankind, uniquely to the Jewish people, is not given, not in nature, and not even a mazalois, and not even a malachim. Nevertheless, we find throughout Chazal, in certain areas, the possibility of them deviating and for them getting punished. Don't forget, you can't get punished if you had no freedom of choice, if there wasn't any choice altogether. So according to Rabbi Yudan Bar Shalom, there was a certain type of deviation. So now the question is, if the earth did not do what God said, it should have gotten cursed right away. Earth was only, Arura Adama was after Chet Adam. So the vart is, the way we were saying before, that why did earth deviate? It deviated because it sensed, so to say, that in the future, man won't live up to his full potential for the first couple of thousands of years, which is why we're still in Golus. In other words, if man were to be perfect, then the earth would have produced Eitzpedi. It wouldn't have been afraid that man would not be able to exercise Gevura, right? Man indulges when they're not supposed to. So it's linked to man's failure. That's why it was only punished after man fell, because it only sinned because it, so to say, knew man is going to fall. Now, Rav Pinchas also agrees that there was a deviation, but there wasn't a deviation that should be viewed as sinful. The earth didn't do less of what God said. The earth did beyond of what God said. And he understands the difference between Eitz Peri or Eitz Oisa Peri is not whether the tree itself is edible or not. No. That God commanded the world to give forth only fruit trees. Eitz Peri, according to Rav Pinchas, means trees. Every tree produced fruit. In the command, there was never Ilan Srak. God never commanded for the earth to give trees that are barren. The earth not only gave Eitz Peri, but actually it understood from an extra letter from God's commandment that it should also give something more. And why would it want to give something more? Is because man, when it builds, it uses lumber. When man wants fuel, right? What could be used for fuel is trees. And why isn't it a pity if you need fuel to cut down a fruit tree? Chaval, it's a baltashkis. So the earth did more of what God commanded. Not it sinned. It did what God said, plus. Wowie. And now the Gemara says, hold on. Let's go back to our original question. How did we get into this? That the Gemara wanted to know, so al data that Rabbi Yudan bar Shalom, that it didn't do exactly what God said. Yeah, it deserved to get punished. But al data that Rav Pinchas, that not only did the earth not sin, but it only added, it followed God's command and it added something, so to say, of its own. So answers the Gemara, you're right. The earth did no sin at all. And only after Adam and Chava failed was the earth cursed. Arura Adam. But why was the earth cursed? So it's like people say that lit biza dechein enak. That if a child sins, there is a certain curse that goes on the mother. It literally meaning a curse is the breast that nursed this one. So we were formed from the earth. So when Adam sinned, subsequently, the earth was downgraded along with him. And indeed, Ba'asya Kai, the Rab Nassan, this fits with a Braisa that was taught in the name of Rab Nassan, that there was no sin whatsoever on behalf of the earth, and that actually corroborates what we learned in the previous Amid, in yesterday, the previous Daf, that no, the nature never changes. We are commanded to leave nature the way it is. Nature is exactly the way God wanted it to be. It's not even possible on any level for there to be any deviation, any diminution, any disobedience. And that only Shloisha nichnasu l'din. Because where was their sin? The Nachash. By the way, that also means that the Nachash needed to have some sort of freedom to choose or some sort of choice. So the Nachash was punished, Chava was punished, Adam was punished, and the earth was punished. Who was being judged? Only Shloisha. But Va'arba Yatsu Mikol Kolim. And the fourth and the final one was, as it says, quoting the words, Aruro Ha'adam Ba'avorecha. All of that is Arayim to Rabbi Pinchas, because according to Rabbi Yudan, the earth was also brought in. Beautiful. Okay. Now, says the Gemara, let's go weiter. Let's go weiter. I'm just looking for a Mephoidish that actually says, according to Rav Pinchas, that the earth understood from an extra Pnei Moshe, that there was an extra verb. It says ve'etz. It understood from God's commandment. It understood that it should both make the eitz peri and the eitz oisa peri. It did both, so there was no sin. And even the addition, it did because it so understood that this is what God wanted. Okay, let's go back. Says the Gemara, so now that we resolved the source, the hint to Harkavas Ilanois, where do we have it in the Torah? From the words Eschu Koisai Tishmeru. Now let's move on to the next topic. We are not allowed to crossbreed birds. Where do you see that from? The Torah only speaks about Behemtecha. I know Satcha and Beged is not even Shaykh. But where do you know you can't crossbreed birds? Machloikas Tanoi. Either is Tanoi Tani also from as Chukasai Tishmairu. Wow, amazing. And as we learned in the previous daf, again, it's not that God made a commandment, but it's chukim shechokakti ba'ilami, that in nature, birds, you look at birds. Birds do not crossmate. Since that's the way, that's the halach of nature, it's self-understood that God does not want for us to crossbreed them. And that's also included in Esru Kaisai, which will be amazing. According to this, Esru Kaisai Tishmeru includes Harkavas Ilanois and Oif. However, is tanoi tane that it's included behem techolei sabia kalayim. How is it included in behem techolei sabia kalayim? We are not saying that behem techa means oifos, but he brings the Rashadil something gewaldig that in Bavli Babakamo in the Aseres Hadibrois, my friends, when we have the pasuk of when we have the commandment of Shabbos in the Aseres Hadibrois of Parshas Voschanan, let's see if we remember this. It says that the Yom Hashvi Shabbos Lashem Alikecha, but Lo Yisase Kol Molocha Ato Vincha Uvitecha Va'avtucha V'Moscha V'Shorcha V'Chamoircha V'Chol Behemtecha. So there's an Isur Doirais of being Machamer Acher Behemtecha. I'm not going to explain all this right now. There's an Isur Doiraisa in that regarding the animals that belong to Eden that they have to rest. When the Torah writes in Veschanon that V'Chol Behemtecha, Chazal learn out that over there V'Chol Behemtecha includes birds. So the Gemara in Bava Kama says that since it says here in Kedoshim, Behemtecha lo yisad b'ya kalayim, it says by the Aseres Hadibros V'Chol Behemtecha, just like the V'Chol Behemtecha by the Ten Commandments includes the type of rest that we have to afford to our animals, also has to be afforded to birds that belong to us. So the Behemtecha lo yisad b'ya kalayim over here also includes oifis. Both of them have the same isur. And the only question is, what's the source of the Isur? L'may nafkamina, what stanza of this pasuk is referring to oifis? So the Gemara gives a gavaldik nafkamina. Says the Gemara that hirkev ilan b'hirbia oif. If you have a person that does two acts, number one, he grafts a tree. He also mates some birds from different species, obviously, and he does it, so to say, with only one hasra'ah. That's the way we'll learn pshat. He'll do it only with one warning. So if we're going to follow the Tana that says that the prohibition of mating birds of different species comes from the same words, which is the same source that prohibits us from grafting different types of trees, we're going to follow the gears of the Marafuda. So when you give a person a hasra, we're going to go with the shita, you have to quote the biblical source. So he quoted one source. It's coming from Eschol Kaisai Tishmanu. So even though the person did two maisim, since both of these actions are prohibited based on the same hasra'ah / the same pasuk, we're going to go with the Yirsa. However, according to the Tana that says, no, that the problem of mating birds from different species comes from the other part of the verse, where it says, Behem techolei sabia kalayim, the issue of grafting trees, lekula alma, comes from the words chukaisai tishmoidu. So when the person says you're not allowed to do that, and he quotes this verse has two clauses, each one is covering another isur. So then chayiv shtayim, and the same thing in the reverse. What happens if a person did two actions, but not grafting a tree and mating a bird? No, he mated animals from different species, and he mated birds from different species. So say, same thing. If the issue of mating a bird is from Chukaisai Tishmairu, which is a different source from the prohibition of animals and Chayiv Shtayim, we're going to go with that gis. But again, according to the Tana that says that birds and animals are both not allowed to be crossbred, all coming from the same pasuk, which is from Behem Techolei Sabia Kalayim. Even though the person did two distinct different things, but they were warned, quoting one pasuk, there was one hasra, and the part of the pasuk that is prohibiting one is the same that prohibits the other, then enachayev elo achas. Okay, let's go back. Says the Gemara, Tani, we learned in a brayz something unique. You're not allowed to graft a branch of an olive by inserting it into a trunk of a palm tree. Why? Because that's the prohibition of ilan be'ilan, as we learned in our Mishnah, right? Ilan be'ilan, yerek be'ilan, ilan be'yerek. Says the Gemara that I want you to know, Rabbi Yudin brings out that the leis hado pligi al Rabbi Levi, doesn't it appear that this braysa argues with the Amoyed of Rabbi Levi? Really, it's the other way around. That's the way it always is in the Yerushalmi. In other words, he's asking Rabbi Levi, how can you honor with the braysa? What does Rabbi Levi say? Rabbi Levi is basing himself on psukim that we say in Tehillim Kapitel Kuf Chav Ches, and that it says Eshtecha, your wife, Kegefen Poidia Biyarchese Beisecha Banim Banecha Kishisile Zeisen Sodav L'Shulchanecha. So there's an allusion of children are like olive shoots that are surrounding your table. Why are we comparing one's children to an olive? Says Rabbi Levi, Ma Zeisen Ein Behem Arkava. Just like he's giving you a botanical law, a natural law, that even if a person were to take an olive branch and they were physically to graft it into another tree, it will not produce a new crossbreed. The same olive will grow out. And that's the blessing that the God gives us, that we should be assured that our children are ours. And there's no mamzerus. There's loyalty. Which is so so he's giving a pasuk, they won't have an illegitimate lineage. So now, for us to have such a if it's the Braisa that says you're not allowed to graft, the kasha's on the Braisa Dani. A olive into the example he gave was to a date tree, a date palm tree. This is the presumption. If an olive has this unique characteristic that even if you were to physically to graft it into another tree, the olive remains the same olive, the product will remain the same product, then it should not even be prohibited. If Rabbi Levi is right, then it should not even be also. Now, really, again, we already quoted the Mishnah. When the Mishnah says you cannot crossbreed a mule and a horse, if the issue of crossbreeding would only to be if it produces an offspring that's now a mixture, then that should not have been prohibited. But that's not a kasha, because when you mate a mule with a horse, even though it doesn't produce a new type of offspring, a mule is sterile; it produces no offspring. Period. But there's a certain warmth that they share one with the other in the act of mating. And that is only shaykh by animals. That type of mixture doesn't exist by a tree. And this kasha of the Gemara is based on the premise that if there is, as Chazal are telling us, that olives are unique, that olives, you can graft it into any tree you want. What will come out of that branch is the same good old olive. So then l'chayr should not be asur, should not be prohibited. Answers the Gemara, that the olive doesn't change, but some taste of the olive will. There'll be a sweetness in the olive. Because shehu asid lematka, because the date palm will allow for the olive branch to absorb some of its sweet sap, and therefore the olives will have a certain sweetness in it. So you're right, the olive will remain the same olive, but it will get something from the date, and that's why it's awesome. But still, it's a beautiful mashal when you want to give a person that all of his children should be his. And how do you know that to be the case? This is amazing. That even when a product doesn't change in its DNA, so you're not making a graft, but it's shaykh to add sweetness into one fruit from another fruit, we find that, and now what we're saying now is mutter to do. Kehador Rab Shimon Beribi, the great Rab Shimon, what did he do? He owned peach trees. Have a mashke, perastike, when he was growing his peaches at the right point, he would pour around the peach trees yain mavushal, cooked wine. Why would he pour cooked wine? Bishvil matka, because he wanted to sweeten it. Now, obviously, when you pour wine around the tree, you're not changing the type of peach at all. The DNA is the same exact DNA. Elama, you're changing some of the taste. You're adding a sweetness. You're adding a sugar. And that would be the reason why it's usher to graft an olive tree into a date palm, even though you're not changing the DNA, because there is some sort of shinui. Beautiful. Moving on to the next mission, halacha ches. As we learned in halacha zayin, that the issue of grafting isn't only ilon be'ilon, it's also, and Kevin, get ready for pictures, it's also yerek be'ilon and ilon be'yerek. And now the Mishnah will give examples. Says the Mishnah, You're not allowed to plant any vegetables inside the stump of a sycamore. Sycamore is a sycamore. Here is where you have clear, look inside the Pnei Moshe, that the sycamore is some sort of fig tree. Now, I don't know if actually all sycamores are figs, but look inside the Pnei Moshe. Shikma hu ilan te'ena hagadol bi'adim. It's some sort of wild, a wild fig tree. So he says you're not allowed to plant vegetables inside it. That will be an example of yerek bi'ilan. Okay. Next case in the Mishnah. Ein markivan, you may not graft. Pagam is rue. Guys, rue is an herb. You don't need the sycamore tree. You need an herb. I want you to know there's a chiddush here. Rue is normally not cultivated. So you would think if you have an herb, right, a yarak, in the category of a yarak, that's normally b'chlal not cultivated, maybe that will be allowed to be planted in trees, also not. And where would have people have grafted it into the kida levana, a white cassia tree. Here we need a picture for that. So then there's a chiddush here. Rue is an herb. It's normally not cultivated. Doesn't matter. You're not allowed to do it because it's still included in the prohibition. Yarag be'ilan. Next case in the Mishnah. You're not allowed to take a branch of a fig tree and you cannot stick it inside. Now we're going a tree and a vegetable. So this vegetable is a grass. The grass is called the chatzuv grass. We are familiar with this grass. When Yeshua divided the land amongst our grandparents, and he wanted to use something as to demark the boundary between one's property and the others, he used this type of grass that goes in very deep and very straight. So wherever you plant it, that's like an internal barrier. And why would someone want even to plant a fig branch inside the chatzuv? Because it's beneficial. How is it beneficial? Because it cools it off. There are two pshatim. Either physically, the chatzuv herb is, so to say, too hot, it's very warm, and when you put a little bit of fig branches in it, it cools it off, or a fig branch actually will grow there, and the shade will keep it cool, whichever way. The Mishnah is just explaining an example of why one, without God's commandment, would have wanted to do it, but this will be a great example where you can do it, and that will be a ilan inside a vegetable. Another example. You may not insert a branch of a grapevine inside a watermelon plant. Now, really, we're not speaking about inserting it in the watermelon proper. You have to know how to plant things. But there is a technique of inserting the vine in the shoydish, in the root of the watermelon, and being that the watermelon accumulates a lot of water, that would be very beneficial for the vine because it would have a better source of irrigation. Says the Mishnah that you're not allowed to do it. Yet why would you want to do it? Could you want for this watermelon, the root of the watermelon, to add water inside the vine? You're not allowed to do that. Why? Because it's ilan biyarak. Now, before we go on, you have a bomb question, which will be the kasha the Gemara is going to ask, and let's see how far we can get. And the question is, the problem when it comes to vines is much worse than harkava of a yarak be'ilan ilan biyarak. There we got an issue of kili akedem. Kili akedem is also bahana. It's prohibited on a whole different level. It's also bein ba'aretz and b'chutz la'aretz midrabanan b'chulei. So why is the Mishnah saying it's only a problem because ilan b'yarek when there's a much bigger problem? That will be what the Gemara is going to answer. So let's leave that question open. Next case in the Mishnah. Don't put a gourd seed into a mallow. Look inside the mallow plant. I don't know if that's a mallow. Okay. In other words, just gourds, they need a certain higher level of temperature for them to be able to germinate. And in other words, a mallow can only grow into something that's relatively hot, hotter than the earth. And that would be a great solution. The mallow plant would give the gourd the warmth that it needs. It would protect it. It would allow it to grow. that you're not allowed to do. Now, I just want you to know that side, the gourd, and the mallow are considered yarok. So the Mishnah gave examples of Elon b'Yarik, Yarik b'Elon, and Yarik b'Yarik. Now, like we spoke out, the Gemara's question is, Rabbi Zacharia Chaskin to Rabbi Levi, Rabbi Zacharia, the son of Rabbi Levi, asked, what do you mean that the problem of a Zemoida shal gefen l'toich havatiach is Elon b'Yarik? No, it's worse. B'leikach eino aser mishum zurayim tachas hagefen. Skilei akerem. So we spoke out that we gave the introduction to the answer in our words of introduction. Let's quickly repeat it. That Kilei Akerem is unique and more stringent, way beyond Kilei Zerayim. Kilei Zerayim is primarily Marasayim. Kilei Akerem is you're not allowed to mix them together. And there has to be a minimum distance. And the difference will be that if we're speaking about a single vine, or what's not called a vineyard, the distance has to be 6 tvachim. If it's a kerem, it has to be 4 amas, can be within that distance. Is machadish the Gemara, whoa, that distance is only for when you are looking at the part that's above the surface. When it comes to looking at what's going on below the surface, only 3 tvachim is needed. And the Gemara is going to give you a scenario where the root of the watermelon is far enough from the vine in which there is no prohibition of kilei akerem. There is no prohibition because it meets the distance, as we'll see. It's beyond 3 tvachim, below the ground. That even when you have a scenario where you planted watermelon under the vines, 3 tvachim deep or deeper, so there is no issue of kilei akerem. But for you now to take the tip of the vine and insert it in the root of the avatiach because you want the vine to get more liquid, that's also only because of Yilan b'Yarik. Now let's read it inside. Amar Rabbi Yosi, Tiftoi, explain our Mishnah. We know the share of Shisha. No. Where do we have the issue of Shisha? Chutz l'Shisha is only above the ground. And if it's within 6 tvachim above the ground, when it comes to a single vine, it's a kilei akerem. And similarly, kadod detani, Shorshay piyam, matter, right, may not enter. If it enters near the vineyard for amas, because again, by a single 6 tvachim, by a vineyard for amas, then you got an issue of kilei hakerem. But where do we have to keep it outside the 4 amas? Only if we're looking at the part of the piyam and the kerem, both that are above the ground. But lamata, but if you're only looking at, you also have to keep the roots a distant, but there has to be much less of a distance. The shear is only 3 tvachim. And l'chayda, just like the Braisa gives 3 tvachim by a kerem, will have the same 3 tvachim, or you can even say a kal v'chaymer when it comes to a vine. So Gavaldik, point is that you are able to plant a watermelon close enough to a vine, ba'oifen, in a way where there is no kilei akerem violation at all. And it is regarding that case that the Mishnah says, yet, if you're going to put one into the other, you're going to create the issue of, again, not in the water, in the root of Yara, of Elon b'Yara. God willing, to be continued.